Hello there, welcome to Cool Talk. Today we talk about the League of Nations and the failure of peace. World War I was called the Great War, the war to end all wars. And after World War I, many were hopeful that the newly formed League of Nations would handle international disputes so that there would be no more war. It was an exciting time, a time of hope. By 1920, 42 nations had joined the League. By 1937, there were 63 nations. Countries would now talk out their problems. But unfortunately, everybody was wrong. But let's talk about that brief period of hope first. The League of Nations was largely a creation of Woodrow Wilson. So it's ironic that the United States never joined the League. Congress didn't want to get entangled in European affairs. And to be fair, Wilson also didn't compromise with Congress, and so he contributed to the failure of the ratification of joining the League of Nations. The League had three parts: the Assembly, the Council, and the Secretariat. Now, the Assembly, the main part, was like a parliament. It admitted all new members, it established a budget, and it oversaw the problems of the world with its representation of all the member nations. The Council was like a board of directors. It had 4 permanent members: Britain, France, Italy, and Japan, and an additional 4 members that were elected annually. The Secretariat was more of an international civil service. The dream was to have no war, and in order to do this, the League of Nations decided to disarm or reduce armaments in many countries. If you look at this statue, it's based on Isaiah Chapter 2, verses 3 to 4 in the Bible, where swords are beaten into plowshares. The League also decided that all treaties had to be transparent, no more secret negotiations. There would also be a world court with judges to make rulings on international law. The League would arrange popular votes of the people to determine the boundaries in Poland and Germany. And to improve the social and economic conditions, loans would be given to the new countries, such as Hungary and Austria. Cooperative educational research projects and schools would be set up, libraries would be built, health agencies established, and the ILO was formed, meaning the International Labor Organization. In the first 10 years, the League was successful in settling 30 serious disputes peacefully, but those were small countries. Major disputes were a lot harder. If you look at this map, you'll find a little city of Vilnius, or Vilna as we call it. It's on the borders, between the borders of Lithuania and Poland. Well, the people of Vilnius voted that they wanted to unite with Poland. Lithuania disputed this. War broke out and lasted 5 years. The League basically could do nothing. Finally, after 5 years, Lithuania gave up its claim. Much more serious was the 1923 incident in Greece. In Greece, an Italian general and 4 staff members were murdered. Now, Italy blamed Greece. There was a king in Italy, but recently a member of the fascist regime, Benito Mussolini, had been given dictatorial powers. He had Italian warships bomb the island of Corfu, and he took the port. It was only after Greece agreed to pay a cash sum of money to Italy that Mussolini had the troops withdrawn. So what did the League of Nations do during this crisis in Italy and Greece? Pretty much nothing. It couldn't do anything. The League could impose its will on small countries, but it had a lot of trouble doing anything with the major powers. First of all, it needed a unanimous vote, and this was often blocked. Second of all, the League had no military force. It could only recommend the use of military force, but no nation was obligated to supply arms. So the League had limited powers. After World War I, France had been promised by the United States and Britain that it would help France in case of an attack by Germany. But after the war, both the United States and Great Britain withdrew that promise. So France began seeking allies elsewhere. Belgium, Poland, Romania, Yugoslavia, and Czechoslovakia. So by looking at the map with all these allies, you could say that Germany was surrounded by France and its allies. Now, when Germany defaulted on some of its war reparation payments, many countries were sympathetic, but not France. France, along with Belgium, marched its troops into the German territory of Ruhr, where Germany had its coal mines and steel mills. France's plan was to take over the industries and the steel mills and use it as partial payment. However, German workers resisted peacefully, and France failed in getting any money out of this. In 1924, a new French government came into power that was friendlier towards Germany. And also an American businessman and future vice president named Charles Dawes recommended that France leave the German Ruhr territory, that the United States would lend Germany some money, allow it some relief, and this plan was accepted by all. A central bank was created in Germany to help it along. France left the German territory, and for the next few years, Germany duly paid its war reparations. Now, remember when I said that the League was trying to get the major powers to agree to disarm, to reduce its military, at least a bit? Well, it had limited progress when it came to the Navy, but the attempts to limit land and air forces in these major nations was a complete failure. And Germany, which was already deprived of its large military forces, was frustrated. These other nations had pledged disarmament, and it wasn't happening. Now, the League of Nations, after the Treaty of Versailles and all its other disputes and treaties that it signed, in 1925, the representatives got together in the Swiss town of Locarno. Representatives of many nations pledged that they would settle their disputes peacefully. Treaties were signed guaranteeing the existing borders between France and Germany, and also Belgium and Germany. Germany was invited to join the League of Nations, and it did. A document was drawn up in 1928 which renounced war. Over 60 nations signed this document. They promised not to fight each other. Great, isn't it? Unfortunately, there was no way to enforce anyone to fulfill this promise. And there was a lot of suspicion and fear still going on in Europe, and many problems. What happened? Let's start with Britain. Britain had lost a lot of trade to Japan and the United States, so many of its businesses had to shut down. Unemployment was on the rise. And a lot of its colonies, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, they desired self-government. After all, they helped Britain during World War I. Well, Britain finally maintained some control. It allowed independence, but it kept British mandates, and a Commonwealth was formed. Trade agreements were strengthened, and unity was achieved. However, in France, there were political problems. Why? Well, let's make some comparisons. In the United States, there is an American president in the executive branch. He's voted into office, and Congress is also voted in individually per state. It doesn't matter what party they're from, there's some stability. In Britain, the Prime Minister is also leader of the majority party in the House of Commons. The House of Commons is like the American Congress. If the Prime Minister resigns or is forced out, the whole party has to leave as well. So a new Prime Minister and a new House of Commons has to be voted in. So the British didn't like to change leaders too often. In France, however, its Congress, which is actually called the National Assembly of Deputies, had tenure. They could force out any French premier, and the cabinet would have to resign with it. And the members of the Assembly of Deputies, would still keep its place. So there was a lot of instability. A premier could be voted out of office by the Assembly at any time. Between 1919 and 1937, 34 governments held office in France. In Germany, there was a new system of government after World War I, the Weimar Republic. It had a new National Assembly that was formed in 1919, a new constitution, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, compulsory education, protection of unions. However, the president also had emergency powers and could legally establish a dictatorship. There were too many political parties, so it was hard for one party to gain a majority in the assembly. So the extremists, both on the left and on the right, blamed the ruling group for accepting the Treaty of Versailles. The Weimar Republic tried to gain the good faith of the world and pay its debts, but this was becoming increasingly difficult. Wild inflation in 1922 and 1923 wiped out people's savings. In 1924, the Weimar Republic changed its currency, increased taxation, and got a loan from the United States. And by 1929, the Republic had become popular, and the industrial production had reached pre-war levels. However, if there was going to be any return to unemployment or inflation, the extremists were looking to take over. Across the rest of Europe, democratic states suffered. The people were illiterate, parties bickered, agriculture was backwards, and the greedy rich landowners blocked reforms so they could preserve their privileges. Now, as a result of this, Poland in 1926, there was a takeover by General Marshal Józef Pilsudski. In Hungary went through several different governments, even a communist one, until Admiral Miklos von Horthy became dictator. But some democracies were successful: Switzerland, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, and Czechoslovakia. Now, Turkey, after World War I, had lost a lot of its territory and independence. Now, the Allies had put a sultan in place. But nationalists, led by Mustafa Kemal, led a campaign to overthrow the Sultan and establish a republic. He succeeded, and the Allies recognized the new government. Kemal was a dictator, but he was a benevolent one. He carried out reforms, prepared the people for self-government, westernized the land, abolished polygamy, introduced a Western calendar and the alphabet, improved education, and he said that everyone had to choose a surname. For himself, he chose the surname Ataturk, father of all Turks. And this father of all Turks, well, he started dressing westernized, Americanized, and he even graced the cover of Time magazine. Now remember that the United States wasn't even a member of the League of Nations. It stayed out of European affairs for the most part. Despite some bankrupt farmers because of the high tariffs, the United States was booming in the 1920s. Women acquired the vote, the automobile changed the landscape. Things were good. It was a roaring 20s. But there were some danger signals. The stock market rose and rose and rose, and despite some farmers being hard-pressed and despite some businesses becoming less active, a lot of people became too complacent and didn't see the warning signs. It was also the era of prohibition, outlawed sale of liquor. This encouraged corrupt politicians, crime syndicates, and bootlegging. But everybody just kept on dancing. In Latin America, business was booming because there was a big demand for wheat, beef, rubber, copper, nitrates, and oil. But just like Europe, landowners exploited the poor and held back reforms. Diseases were rampant, and some countries had a 75% illiteracy rate. But Mexico led the way. After years of revolution and disorder, a new constitution and reform secured the oil fields and restricted the power of one of the largest landowners in Mexico, the Catholic Church. And soon, 7 other nations adopted liberal constitutions. After World War I, African nations also wanted the end of colonial rule. But they didn't acquire self-government completely. They stayed under the influence of European nations. Britain would control Tanganyika, Belgium would control Rwanda and Urundi, France and Britain would control the Southwest Africa Union, or what we call today South Africa. Now, the Arabs of North Africa had 2 big advantages. They shared a common language, Arabic, and a common religion, Islam. In 1923, an Egyptian revolt broke out and Egypt became a sovereign state. Now, during World War I, many Arab tribes revolted against the Ottoman Empire, and Britain helped them, promising them self-government afterwards. Well, England reneged, and, along with France, divided the lands between them, created mandates. Hostilities grew, and while France struggled with Syria and Lebanon, Britain had more success in Iraq. Iraq would acquire independence with military limitations by 1930. And now comes the interesting story of the new kingdom of Hejaz. It was conquered by Ibn Saud. He consolidated the whole peninsula under his rule and renamed the land Saudi Arabia. In 1932, rich oil reserves were discovered. And in Persia, in 1921, Riza Shah Pahlavi took over. He attempted to modernize the country, which soon changed its name to Iran, but he became a tyrant and would be overthrown in 1941. Palestine. Oh boy, Palestine. In 1917, the British indicated that a national home for the Jews would be established in Palestine. And 3 years later, a Jewish immigration began to flow in. It became a British mandate. Farms prospered, cities were built. But most of Palestinian residents were Arabs, and they saw the Jews as intruders. In the 1930s, Jews left Nazi Germany and populated Palestine. The Arabs resorted to guerrilla warfare, and this enmity between both nations still continues. India had provided Britain with over 1 million troops during World War I, and now it wanted independence. Britain conceded some liberties, but the Indians were disheartened. They found a spokesman in Indian lawyer Mohandas K. Gandhi, who championed their cause. And despite his pleas for nonviolent resistance, peaceful protest, and non-cooperation, there was violence. It took decades. In fact, I'm getting ahead of myself because India would not become independent until after World War II. But India acquired its independence. However, the rivalry between the Hindus and the Muslims would bring about a civil war and the breaking away of India's territory into two nations, India and Pakistan. It also resulted in the assassination of Mohandas Gandhi. In China, in 1911, before World War I, the Manchu dynasty had to abdicate the throne. An imperial army led by a Yuan Sheikh Kai came over to put down the revolt but became a leader. But son Yet-Sen, a Chinese nationalist who was exiled, returned and led the rebels in the south. He fought against Yuan, he fought against the warlords, and he united the country. By 1921, he would become president. He turned to the West for help in uniting China, but was unsuccessful. So he turned to the new communist government in Russia, which supplied him with arms and advisors. He died in 1925, but was succeeded by the brilliant military officer Chiang Kai-Shek, who captured Peking and united China. But then Chiang executed many communist sympathizers and liberals. He would later build factories, railroads, and new highways. The new national government was recognized in the West. So, as you can see, it's safe to say that the League of Nations had failed. It settled several small disputes, but not the major ones. And this would lead to more turmoil and tension that would move along to World War II. But before we get there, we need to discuss the Russian Revolution, again, with special emphasis on the rise of Joseph Stalin. After that, dictators Mussolini and Hitler, and finally, World War II. Until then, send me your comments below, or better yet, subscribe. This is Cool Talk.